So we are live. Welcome to a new session of Voyages into the Past. Today we have with us Dr. Arunabh Ghosh, Associate Professor of History at Harvard University and the author of Making It Count, Statistics and Statecraft in the Early People's Republic of China. This session is divided into two segments. The first segment will be anchored between Aritra and me, and then the floor would be open to the audience. So, sir, I'm starting with the questions.
Sure.
So I was wondering that the National Bureau of Statistics of China was established in 1952. So a question came up, how did the National Bureau calculate the statistical data from 1949 to 51?
So this is a good question. The mistake is mine because I only shared the introduction to the book with you all and not the entire book. But in the first chapter, I try and look at the kinds of statistical activity that both was engaged in from 1949 to 1952. So even 52 is important because the National Bureau of Statistics, or back then it was known as the State Statistics Bureau, does not get established until the second half of the year, until August of 1952. So you have 8 months in 1952 also. So what you had after 49 was essentially the Central Economics and Finance Commission that oversaw statistical activity. And this was sort of more of an ad hoc thing that was set up actually set up before 49 itself. But the idea was that it'll oversee all kinds of economic reorganization and financial reorganization. And of course, they were relying very heavily on what happened and what existed before 1949, right? So what the kinds of statistical infrastructure that had been put in place by the nationalist government effectively from 1912 onwards, but then especially in the 1930s. So they were relying on a lot of that. And this had some interesting variations because, again, for those of you who know this period in Chinese history, we call it the Nationalist Period. When the Qing Empire falls in 1911, in 1912, the nationalist government is set up, or the Republic of China is set up. And then on the mainland, that lasts till 1949, when the communists win the Civil War and establish the People's Republic. And when Chiang Kai-shek then at that time, withdraws to Taiwan, and where the Republic of China survives to this day in some ways. But that's sort of one way to think of this period as sort of easy transitions from empire to one particular kind of republic to the People's Republic. But in reality, from the 19-teens, 20s, 30s into the 40s, you have all kinds of different political formations that are vying for control. So in some places, the nationalist government has good control and they're able to do statistical activity. But in many other areas, you have what is known as warlord control, or some areas actually become much more autonomous, even independent. What we today call Xinjiang and Tibet essentially operate as independent countries at this time. So you see a lot of variation in practices and actual state administration through the 30s and 40s, in 20s, 30s, and 40s. But of course, the main role is still largely played by the nationalist government. And so when the communists come to power in 1949, they look to see what the nationalist government has done and try and build on that. And of course, as you've seen in the chapter, in the introduction, they start out by saying, we totally want to reject what has been happening before, because it's not only just incomplete and poorly structured and so on, but it's also at a very fundamental level, not wrong. It's not scientific. It's not correct in some ways. So that's sort of a brief answer for what was going on before 52.
So, sir, by reading your introduction, I also a question also sparked that what is socialist statistics and how did it transform when China shifted towards market socialism?
Yeah, so this is again a very good question, and so socialist statistics emerges again as the introduction gives you a sense of, and then the rest of the book sort of really expands on. Incidentally, if any of either you or any of the other people listening and are interested, they should feel free to email me, and I'll try and get them at least a PDF copy of the book if they want to read all of it, right? So I'd be happy to share that with them. To go back to your question about what happens after sort of the transition to the market economy, there is, in very simple terms, there's a much larger transition and a much larger sort of reappraisal of a lot of sort of methods and approaches that takes place after 1978. In some ways, it is an opening up of sort of possibilities of both critiquing existing practices and engaging again with a much wider array of things that are going on, and say, in this case, in the world of science and statistics globally. So that helps sort of facilitate this transition. And again, it's something I allude very briefly to at the end of the introduction, but there are a couple of figures, couple of very important statisticians who are seen by now, by the late 70s, senior professors at major universities in Beijing, who take advantage of this opening up, this climate of relative opening up, to say that, we have been doing statistics wrong. We have been relying on a particular definition of statistics, as you just rightly said, socialist statistics, that is actually limiting. It's self-limiting, and it's limiting us in terms of what we can do. And then this particular professor, his name is Daisha Guang, he writes a couple of essays in major statistics journals in 1979, and this then opens up the space to have a much broader dialogue about, well, what is statistics, what should it be like, and so on. But just because a dialogue is generated doesn't mean that the transition is immediate. So I'll give you a sort of an interesting anecdote. I mentioned in the book also. So one of the things that happens as a result of defining statistics as a social science in the 1950s is that you see a bifurcation. Those people who do mathematical statistics end up in math departments, or in physics departments, or in engineering departments, applied science, and so on. And those who do the social sciences of statistics end up in stats departments. So then they're doing demography, they're doing other kinds of, sort of government statistics, or a collection of sort of social, what's going on in society. And this distinction becomes so strong by the late 70s and early 80s that you can go to a top university in China, say someone in the early 80s, when the university system is reopened, right? So after during the Cultural Revolution, all universities were shut down. But in the late 70s, the universities are opened up again. So you had this massive interest amongst not just 18, 19-year-olds, but people who were in their mid-20s, who, when they finished school, they could not even go to university, but they're now suddenly able to. So they take exams. So you can imagine, this is, we think of our IITs and our other sort of exams as being uber competitive. But imagine now if there's been no IIT exam for 10 years. And now it's not just the regular annual, number of students taking it, but the backlog of 10 years. So it was that kind of exam. You can imagine. So the people selected, you can imagine how accomplished they were, because it was not just the cream of the crop, it was the cream of the cream of the cream of the crop in some ways, that generation that emerged in the early 80s and went to university. But even there, so many of them, for instance, if someone got into, say, a top university like Fudan in Shanghai, and wanted to go and study statistics, but in the math department, they were doing mathematical statistics, then they would actually be doing it entirely as a math discipline, as a math subject, and not engage with any kind of social data. So if you think about, they would not encounter, for instance, demographic data, they would not encounter production data, agricultural data. And I heard this from a professor who is now in the US, who got trained in mathematical statistics in the 1980s in China. He said that the first time he encountered a histogram with socioeconomic data was when he arrived in the US and took his first class in statistics as a graduate student, as a PhD student. Because until then, he said, my entire training had been in mathematics and in abstract sort of probability theory and other kinds of things related to abstract sort of mathematical problems, and not with how mathematics intersects with the social world, which is what, statistics, a large part of statistics is. It's not entirely that. So, so this distinction, even though you had this opening up that emerged in the late 70s, there was a period through the 80s where there was debate, discussion, and it's not just a question of definitions changing, but it's also how do you change curricula? How do you sort of maybe reestablish departments, create a new department of statistics that is more that mingles this old definition of social and natural and so on. So it took time. And the other way in which you can think about why it took time is throughout this period, if you look at, a very key measure of economic activity, as you all know, is GDP, right? GDP is, we all obsess about GDP these days. But in the socialist system, and within socialist economics, so it's true in the former USSR, it was true in the People's Republic of China through the 1980s and early 90s, the system by which you calculated GDP was different from the system used in many other countries. Most countries used a system known as I think it's called the system of national accounts, which was designed by the UN and then used broadly. And its key feature is that it counts not only material production, so not only furniture and agricultural yield, not steel and computers and so on, material goods, but also services. It acknowledges that all kinds of services are also economic activity, and they should be included in any calculation of total economic production. The socialist system did not do this. The socialist system only calculated material products. And so this transition is the other way in which you can see how it changed in the 80s as China also transitioned from this system known as the material product system to a system of national accounts. That again was a process. It took time.
Right. So the next question is, how Cold War and the subsequent ideological rift play a role in the making of science in China? Also, did USSR has any role in the making of statistics as a discipline in People's Republic of China?
Okay, again, yeah, these are very important questions. Let me answer the second one first, and then we can go into because the second one is even broader, because you're talking about what is the role of the Cold War and ideology in science. But the first one, where you talk about the role of the Soviet Union, is huge, actually. The Soviet Union's role, especially in 1950s and 1960s China, is you can see it present in almost every sphere of life, every sphere of activity. And in many instances, even today, a lot of the systems, the way in which certain kinds of government systems are structured, the way in which certain kinds of public goods are delivered, owes a lot actually to learning from the Soviet Union in the 1950s, right? So you can see some iteration of that model still in place, still present today. But in the 50s, the Soviet influence is hugely important. In 1949, the two countries signed a 30-year sort of treaty of mutual aid and friendship. So it was supposed to last from late 1940s to the late 1970s. And as part of this treaty of mutual aid and friendship, the Soviet Union not only helped materially by giving loans, by helping set up factories, and giving other kinds of raw materials, but it also sent thousands of experts across a whole range of disciplines, from the hard sciences and engineering to social sciences and other areas. There are different estimates. One set of estimates says that through that first decade, from 1949 to 1959, as many as 18,000 Soviet experts spent some time in China. Some could be a short trip, few months. Some could spend up to 2 or 3 years. But over that entire period, up to 18,000 went. A large number of these, about 7,000 or 8,000, I think, if I'm not wrong, were actually advising the military, so advising the People's Liberation Army. But then there were many others who were in other areas. And in statistics too, the influence is very important. So even the setting up of the State Statistics Bureau, your first question, that was done under the advice of a Soviet statistician who was himself a vice director of the Soviet Statistics Bureau. So he came in and said, this is how you should design a national statistical system. And then the fact that they promoted so heavily what we were talking about, this idea of socialist statistics, which is rejecting rejecting the fact that statistics is a universal science, claiming that it's a social science, which means that we reject any sort of use of probability and uncertainty and randomized methods in doing statistics. This was very much also the case in the Soviet Union. So they are using both the practice in the Soviet Union, but also you have to remember in the 50s, the Soviet Union is a great example for a lot of, especially if you're already a socialist country, you're committed to socialist ideals, you look around and you see the Soviet Union, it is a remarkably successful case. So it's very inspiring, right? They are one of the two superpowers in the world. They fought the Second World War. Some would argue that their role was decisive in defeating the Axis powers and defeating Germany. They were devastated economically, but then they recovered very quickly. And, in the 50s, they're doing well. So it was just not a question of telling people what to do. It was also being able to say, look at what we have achieved. And we have achieved this because of these particular methods and these particular approaches. So it was a very sort of compelling model to try and emulate in some ways. So in statistics, you see the role of these experts and the role of Soviet models playing a very large role in setting up something like institutionally setting up the State Statistics Bureau, in designing university curriculum, for instance, how statistics gets taught, for instance. And also this very strong distinction and rejection of probabilistic methods, which it doesn't stay through the 1950s because the Chinese discover at some point that it's not working for them. This particular over-reliance on exhaustive enumeration and not using randomized methods is not working for them. But that's something that I get into later in the book. But initially, the Soviet influence is hugely important. And of course, as you said, this is partly the way in which the Cold War is playing out, the second part of your question. But what's interesting is that the Cold War then also makes interesting kinds of demands on how people understand what science is. So beyond a general sense that yes, science is a tremendous tool and a body of knowledge that we can use, and both on the both sides of the Iron Curtain try and operationalize science in specific ways, but and think of science as being fundamental to their ability to grow, to create the kind of society they want. The actual practices that they follow end up being quite different, and statistics is a good example of this, because both are heavily committed. When the Soviet Union and the People's Republic say science is statistics is a social science, from our current perspective, we can say, well, this might be too ideologically constrained. But at that point, they're seeing this as doing science at the cutting edge, right? They understand the true nature of statistics and the true scientific nature of statistics. So in some ways, you see the specific sort of commitments in the Cold War also then affect the ways in which science is defined and understood in particular ways. There's again, if people are interested, one of the chapters was also published in the book. A version of a chapter in the book was published in the History of Science journal Osiris, where I talk about this in terms of what it means for statistics to be redefined in different ways depending on where in the Cold War countries were. In the context of China itself, what's interesting also is that the Cold War leads to an interesting kind of dialectical tension, because on the one hand, you want to see science broadly as a universal category that's coming, a lot of it's coming from abroad that has to be mastered. But at the same time, again, for those of you who are familiar with this period of Chinese history, there is a tremendous push to rely also on local resources. From an Indian context, or in a contemporary context, this whole Atmanirbhar kind of jargon. But the idea is, so self-reliance, that we will draw upon our own long-standing knowledge practices, the experience of our people, and in particular, this is again not knowledge as practiced by elites, but knowledge that resides in the average person, right? So this goes back to some of Mao's own theoretical understanding of where true wisdom and true knowledge and true experience reside, and he said it resides in the masses. So the role of, in some ways, the party cadres also is not to always expound on high theory and then tell people what to do. It's actually to go down to the masses, learn from the masses. But yes, the masses, because they are, they're not refined thinkers. They have great knowledge. But so the duty of the cadre becomes to go there, gain from them this raw, unformed wisdom, modify it, hone it, and then use it in some ways, right? So this whole idea of the mass line was very much this idea of this recursive process where senior party cadres have to go down to the countryside, meet with the peasants, learn from the peasants, take their ideas, refine them, try and put them into practice, see what works, go back to the peasants and say, is this working? If not, then let's refine it, and so on. So there was this tension between foreign and outside knowledge and local knowledge. That was very much a part of the Cold War in China. But there's some people who have done very interesting work on the history of science in China who have said that there's a second way in which this kind of dialectical tension exists. One is, as I said, foreign versus native or local, right? Local knowledge. The other, though, given the way in which the political economy of China was evolving and the role of the central government vis-a-vis local governments and county level, commune governments, and so on was concerned, was also this tension between center and local. So how do we then do science as a local practice versus science that is dictated from Beijing? So this is another interesting feature of the socialist period, where you have two kinds of dichotomies: the foreign versus local, foreign versus native, and center versus local, that you see playing out.
So did the mass line influence statistics during the Deng Xiaoping period?
So this short answer would be no, because the mass line itself in many ways was discredited during the Deng period, sort of post 78, right? Mm-hmm. So this was seen as part of being the Maoist excess in some ways, and Deng very strongly. So Deng, his whole slogan of the 4 modernizations, right, that he came up with, and it was not a new slogan actually. If you look at the history of this slogan or the history of this kind of policy formulation, the first instance was actually in 1954. Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister of China, first articulated this idea of four modernizations as being critical to China's future in 1954. Then he actually repeats it in 1963 as an articulation, and then he repeats it again in 75. And only then after both he and Mao Zedong are no more, and Deng is able to rise to power by 78, does he push it through. And that's the time when it actually takes on a really powerful meaning. So the ideas have been around, but they've never been able to push for them in the ways in which Deng was able to push them after 78. But in that formulation, then the mass line really does not stay. It may rhetorically still be present if you look in the early 80s, but in practice, it really withdraws. So the way in which especially in the second half of the 1950s into the 60s, the mass line was very much a part of not just the rhetorical sort of positioning of the Communist Party, but also in practice affected how people did things. That is very different by the late 70s and early 80s.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is, what was the role of China during Cold War, and how they formulated their foreign policy during that war? What was the role of the neighboring countries of India during Indochina War of 1962?
So the last question I'll have to say I'm ignorant of. I haven't looked very closely at the war itself, so I don't know, say, what policies and say, especially Pakistan people would still have an idea, but say what Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh wasn't even created at that time, of course, but other, Burma, what the policies there were, that I can't speak to. But the role of the USSR, of China in the Cold War there's been a lot of very interesting scholarship on this. For a long time, it was not. It was seen entirely through the prism of the very standard Cold War narrative, right, which is looking at the US and the USSR and what they were doing, and then what other countries were doing in relation to the two big superpowers, right? So in that context, what's important in the Chinese case is the fact that in the 50s, China was very closely aligned to the Soviet Union. In 1960, there's a major split between the Chinese and the Soviets, and then what China is doing in the 60s is not as important until there is a rapprochement between the US and China in 1971, which leads to a recalibration of the balance of power within the Cold War, because the US now becomes closer to China, so the Soviet Union is much more sidelined, and then that you follow that through with reform and opening up to the collapse of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union itself in the late 80s and early 1990s during the time of Gorbachev. That's a very sort of Soviet Union and US-centric kind of perspective on this relationship, right? What recent scholarship has done is actually really expanded our understanding by looking actually at what the Chinese foreign ministry, Chinese leaders, and also a lot of Chinese in different sort of other strata of society were doing. And there you see that starting in the 60s, after the split, the Sino-Soviet split, and also after the war with India in 62, China takes on a very conscious role as an alternative to both the Soviet Union and to the US, as an alternative, as a global leader, as a model for a global leader, and as a place that sort of says that we will lead the world into a better future. And a lot of this propaganda, a lot of this diplomacy, a lot of this sort of rhetorical positioning is directed at what we would call either the third world or the global south. So there's a massive sort of attempt to reach out to various countries in Africa, various countries in Latin America, and various countries in Southeast Asia, and various countries in our Indian neighborhood, right? So this is also a time when a relationship with Pakistan becomes much, much stronger, begins to become much stronger, right? But it's not purely realpolitik that is driving a lot of this, Chinese foreign policy making. A lot of this is really based on an understanding that the Soviet Union has compromised on its commitment in some ways to socialism. So now the burden has fallen on China, which saw itself as the junior partner in the 50s. It has fallen upon China to become the leader of the socialist world. So there's a lot of sort of resources that are devoted and dedicated to offering, again, material aid, technical aid, building all kinds of solidarities across the global south, promoting various kinds of movements that are, say, against race-based inequality or other kinds of imperial oppression and so on in other parts of the world. And this you see through the 60s and the 70s in a variety of spheres. So again, if people are, if you are interested, you can send me an email later on, and I can suggest a few different books that look at this in greater detail, right, to try and understand China's foreign policy in a in a truly global sense, as opposed to purely in a narrow sort of US versus USSR Cold War sense.
Okay, now the session, I hand over the session to Aritra, and he will moderate the rest of the session.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Sambit. Thank you very much for inviting me to take over the rest of the sessions, and thank you, Professor Ghosh, for joining with us in this wonderful session.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
So, sir, you have mentioned in your previous answers that China People Republic of China approach their statistical knowledge about the statistical knowledge and etc. But in your book, you have mentioned 1950 this year as a conjecture or as a significant year. So my question is that why you have chosen this year as a basic or significant year throughout revisiting the relationship between India and China and throughout the approaches that People Republic of China spend over to the rest of the world.
Right. So, just to clarify your question, are you referring more to my article, or are you talking about the book more generally? And
yes, I have referenced your article that revisiting before 1962 the case for 1956 China's Indian history.
Right. Because the I mean 1949 is significant in various ways. Both to Chinese history and then to the history of sort of understanding China and India. And do you want me to comment on both, or one in particular, like the China-India sort of approach, or more just in the context of Chinese history?
I think that it would be better if you make your discussion about the revisiting Indian-Chinese this bilateral relationship rather than the statistical one.
Great. Okay. Right. So well, the reason I say 1949, I mean, there's an immediate political context, as you all know. 1949 is when the People's Republic is set up. There is very interesting sort of. There's been some work that's been published on this, but hopefully in the coming year or 2 years there'll be at least one essay that will be published. I'm working on a series of edited. I'm working with a few other people to edit a series of essays, and one of those essays will look at actually. The process through which India formally recognized the People's Republic of China. What were the deliberations, say, from 1948 itself? So, India is already the Republic of India, Nehru's prime minister, and they have at that point been dealing with the Republic of China, whose capital is in Nanjing, and we have an ambassador, K.M. Panikkar, who's already in Nanjing representing the Indian government, dealing with Chiang Kai-shek and so on. But already by late 1948, there is a sense that the communists are winning in the civil war, right? And there is already, so if you read some of these letters and some of these memos that are going between Panikkar and Nehru, and then the letters that Nehru is writing, say, his fortnightly letters to the chief ministers, or other internal memos, say, between Krishna Menon, with Sardar Patel and so on, there is already a discussion about, well, what should we do? It seems it's becoming more and more clear that the communists are going to win. And if they win, then we'll have to decide what to do with regard to what India's former position will be. So you see slowly how this position evolves, that we have to accept that the PRC is going to be established, and we have to formalize the diplomatic relations and so on. So that process goes from 1948 into 1949, and then again, as many of you might know, India formally recognizes the PRC in December of 1949, a few months after the PRC itself is set up. So there is this makes it, from a narrow political history perspective, 1949 therefore becomes important. But it's also, I think, important from a broader understanding of sort of what kinds of interactions we can track between China and India. And you see a qualitative change after 1949, at least for a few years, until 62, and things become more complicated again. There is always an interest. There's a great interest pre-49 through the first half of the 20th century. In sort of from the Chinese towards India, and from the Indians towards China, but it's fairly scattered, and it's not it doesn't reach the level of engagement that you see in the early 1950s. Some of this is very much state to state. It's being pushed because of the post World War II the new kind of geopolitical reality. But it's also because once you facilitate these kinds of things, there's also a tremendous amount of interest spanning a range of spheres. So it's not purely, say, building towards some kind of, as the Cold War is forming, can China and India propose something, an alternative of some kind, or a different way of thinking about international politics? But it's also recognition at a very basic level that the kinds of challenges that confront China and India are very similar. From a socio-economic perspective, from a governance perspective. And so you see not just the elite leadership, but you see people who are engineers, administrators, various kinds of scientists, various kinds of even cultural and literary figures who are really interested and curious to see what is going on in China, right? And to visit. And then similarly, you have a similar kind of interest from the Chinese side. And this leads to, I think, a whole range of interactions that are, I think, important to track. So that's partly why 1949, I think, does become somewhat important as a marker of a shift in the quality and the quantity of the actual exchanges taking place and so on, and the attempt to learn from each other in some ways.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your valuable answer. My second question is quite phenomenal. That is, you have mentioned in your article that I have mentioned it before, that in 1951, the film Hindi film Awara, which means the vagabond in English,
right,
got much popularity in China, and 2 million tickets had been sold. And in 1955, when a Chinese film named Bai Mao Nun, or the white-haired girl, so broadcasted in India, they got a massive popularity in India. So my question is, how much the popular culture and material artifacts of visual transmission, such as cinema, theater, etc., influence the culture of both the countries?
This is a great question, and I think we still have only scratched the surface of trying to understand, what this mutual. I wouldn't say there was an understanding, but a mutual appraisal was like. And I think looking at film is a huge part of this, but looking at other media also and other areas of cultural production. So in literature, the kinds of sort of literary and artistic magazines that were produced, including, artwork, paintings, sketches, other kinds of things. There's a whole sort of area that we only have scratched the surface on. And I think we actually have a lot of materials. If we start looking, whether it's in local archives, local libraries, state libraries, you will find, and in vernacular languages, not just say focus on English or Hindi predominantly, which focuses attention on Delhi and what Delhi was sort of the people in Delhi were trying to do, but go to regional places. So engage in Malayalam, Tamil, Bangla, and see the kinds of things being produced. We will discover a very large archive, I think, of materials. Film is, I think, the most perhaps. Sorry.
No, sir. You can continue.
No. So I said film is perhaps the most evocative, because it brings people together. It's a communal shared experience. 500 people sitting in a movie theater watching together is very different from individually reading a poem sitting at home, right? So in that sense, film, I think, is hugely important, and it resonates but the from what we can tell at this point, the resonance is uneven, in the sense that I think Indian film has had a much deeper and longer lasting resonance in China than Chinese film has had in India, whether for the 50s or more recently from the 80s onward itself. So there's a scholar of Chinese literature and Chinese film who is right now working on a book on film in the China-India relationship. And she tracks it from the 1950s all the way to the present moment, where Amir Khan is now he's a megastar in China, right? Because of the success of Three Idiots and Dangal and PK and all of these movies. So she tries to understand this entire process and how it affects a mutual understanding or a mutual appraisal. We haven't seen the same degree of success for Chinese films. There have been some films that have been well received, but they haven't reached the kind of mass appeal that I think Indian films have. This fits into, I guess, broader questions about the success of Bollywood and success of Indian films more generally, in terms of because they are quite successful in various parts of the Middle East, in Africa, and even in Latin America. People have grown up watching Indian films on Sundays, which does not happen with Chinese films. So there is a distinction, but why that is and how much of that is. This is the kind of thing that we would need more research on, right? How much of this is based on form and content of the films themselves, the production, versus more the questions of political economy, in terms of distribution networks, in terms of how do these films actually, who is sending them out, by what mechanisms, how are they being screened, is it easy for distributors to access them, and so on, right? So these are in some ways more boring questions seemingly than trying to understand the script of a film, the artistry that went into set design, what kinds of things are being evoked, and so on. but I think they're just as important. And to give you a very simple example of why, throughout the past 3 decades, when, since 4 decades since China started opening up, the number of foreign films that can be shown in China is limited every year. And this number is usually capped. It used to be capped at 30. I don't know what the latest number is. So the Chinese film, I forget what the institution is called, but something like the Chinese Film Bureau or Board decides which films get imported into China for screening in theaters, foreign films, right? So there is an element of decision making and an element of very clear state interference, much more so than perhaps in other contexts where this is a purely commercial decision. In the Chinese case, it has never been purely commercial. But since the early 2000s and the spread of the digital age, just because the state doesn't allow a certain movie to come in doesn't mean much, because people can access pirated versions. So, this is something that I think Amir Khan realized in interesting ways, because they didn't really distribute Three Idiots in a very aggressive way in China, but they discovered that it was bootlegged and pirated and seen widely. So they realized they had lost a lot of money. So in subsequent films, they actually tried to push through proper channels to get PK and Dangal released in China. And then, as you know, Dangal made more money in China than it did in India, right? So there's also these mechanisms I think are important to also try and track in terms of what is the political economy of filmmaking in particular. It doesn't apply as much to, I think, other areas of art where there are perhaps other things going on. And of course, there's, if you look at Bengali cinema, there's also a huge impact, I think, of left politics, given what was going on in Bengal in the 50s and 60s. So the kinds of movies that got made were heavily influenced by, if not directly by Chinese film, but then at least from a sense of what was happening in China and the kind of sort of ambition, the ideals to create a new kind of society that I think, so someone like Ritik Ghotok or other directors that were hugely inspired by China as a model. So that's part of the story also.
Thank you, sir. My next question is, sir, as we know that there was a kind of opposition towards quote-unquote Western hegemony found throughout the history of both countries. Mm-hmm. So in that case, was there a lucid scope of commonality in terms of the construct of nationhood between them? Or can this aspect be seen as the coherent journey of both India and China up to 1962?
Sorry, what kind of journey?
Can it as a coherent journey of
coherent journey
up till 1962?
Right. So I think this is an interesting question, because it speaks to, the role of nationalism versus sort of transnational kinds of ideological movements, political movements. Because what's interesting is, if you look at the ways in which Chinese and intellectual elites, both cultural elites and other kinds of intellectuals thought about this relationship, it goes through different phases. There's one phase, at least in the late 19th century itself, where you see a certain kind of appraisal that takes place, where both see themselves as being somehow dominated by Western imperialism. India, of course, much more completely than China. But Chinese intellectuals are deeply both concerned, but they see India as a negative example in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Sort of like, yes, we in China have been deeply the West has deeply interfered with us, and we are under all kinds of unfair treaties. You have extraterritoriality. So many of our cities have essentially foreign presence. But then look at how much worse things could be. Like, India has become completely dominated and completely colonialized, and we must try and avoid that. So there is that kind of attempt to understand why it happened, what happened, and so on. And a central figure in these a lot of these discussions is a very influential Chinese intellectual by the name of Kang Youwei, who was a very important figure in the late 19th century reform movements in China, especially in the 1890s. And when one of these reform movements, known as the 100-day reforms in 1900, when it fails, the Chinese, what is still the empire at that point, the imperial government and the emperor, not the emperor, but his grand aunt who tries to replace him, they basically are hunting for Kang Youwei. So Kang Youwei has to run, and he runs. And where does he go to? He actually comes to India. He comes and spends 2 years in the northeast, in Darjeeling and Kalimpong, that area, and that allows him actually and he travels to other parts of India also during this time, but that allows him to begin a serious study and engagement with Indian history to try and from a very, again, from this precise perspective that your question is coming from, which is the role of Western hegemony, Western imperialism, and how do we sort of emerge out of it, and how do we escape it, and so on. And he comes up with certain philosophical ideas that are actually not nation state based. I mean, one can argue that in the end, if you scratch the surface, nationalism does emerge because it is such a strong and powerful idea, already in the 19th century. But he speaks of something known as the Great Unity, and which is actually a trans-historical, trans-national kind of concept for a future that is, that we can all aspire to. And some of his ideas are emerging at a time when, as you know, in Japan, ideas about Pan-Asianism are also evolving, right? And Pan-Asianism becomes initially as this very powerful idea that thinks of Asia as some kind of unit that can stand up against and provide an alternative to Western hegemony. It emerges out of Japan, but it's hugely influential for a lot of intellectuals in China, a lot of intellectuals in India are really inspired by it, and in India, none more so than Tagore himself. Right, Tagore becomes a great votary of this kind of thinking beyond nation states, thinking beyond sort of narrow boundaries. And so you see a lot of activity, a lot of engagement in trying to understand what Pan-Asianism might mean, and part of that becomes then an attempt to study the histories of not just nationalist histories, like siloed Indian history, Chinese history, Japanese history, but looking at histories that actually covered the entire Asian landmass. And one of the central areas of research then becomes the history of Buddhism, because Buddhism is something that really over 2,000 years travels all across these present-day boundaries, influences art, influences literature, influences religion, in all these places. So that becomes a useful way to try and think about alternative ways of thinking about political space that is not purely defined by nations and that is not dictated to Asian countries by Western formulations. But again, as you know, Pan-Asianism itself becomes discredited because Japan becomes an imperial power by the 1930s, right? So it starts using Pan-Asianism to justify its imperial expansion. And then Pan-Asianism becomes not so much a way for all Asians to seek solidarity, but it becomes a way for Japan to justify its dominance over other Asian countries. Like, we will help you sort of develop, and we will create what they call the Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, right? Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. So that leads to a disillusionment with Pan-Asianism and an attempt then to seek out other alternatives going forward. So you have these different iterations that I think travel through, and then when you get to the 40s and early 50s, you see a rearticulation because now the Cold War imposes its own logic, and that's when people like Nehru, but also people like Zhou Enlai become invested in ideas of finding out alternative ways to frame the autonomy of nation states that are in the global South. So this is I'm giving you a very sort of sweeping answer, but there are this is again where you can track a very interesting intellectual genealogy through the decades. The sad thing, of course, is I think that a lot of the momentum has been lost, right? If you look at the history now of the past several decades and what's happening now, everywhere we are essentially descending into a very narrow nationalist kind of framework. Whether it's the rise of Hindutva kind of ethno-nationalism in India, you have a very similar kind of Han nationalist discourse that has become very sort of influential in China and in other countries in Asia also. So in some ways, I think that promise of thinking past the nation state as the defining category of identity, we are it would be perhaps too pessimistic to say that has failed, but we are in a particular low point in those possibilities, I think, because the forces that are dominant are right now very much precisely those that I think, say, people like Nehru and a lot of Chinese and Indian intellectuals in the 40s and 50s would have tried to resist, would have said this is not very productive.
Okay. Sir, you have mentioned, and we all know that for this well-developed bilateral relationship between these two countries, many associations, just like CIFA or China-India Friendship Association or ICFA, India-China Friendship Association, that had been formed. And they told to maintain a coherent relationship between these both two countries. So were these kind of institutions represented the diplomatic channels between the two countries? Or were these institutions a result of friendly coexistence was developed through sponsorship or treaty of peaceful coexistence or after the Bandung points that was said.
So it's a bit of everything, because for starters, the CIFA and the ICFA were not exactly the same kind of institution. So from the kinds of sort of little research that I have done and the conversations I've had, so CIFA, so from the China side, right, the China-India Friendship Association, which was based in China, had a much stronger connection to the state. And it was part of a much larger sort of way in which the Chinese state maintained relationships with various other countries. And this was, again, actually modeled on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did this too, right? So you had a China-India Friendship Association, a China-Pakistan Friendship Association, you had a China-Soviet Union Friendship Association, and so on. And they were overseen by a central office. So there was a greater degree of state control. On the Indian side, it seems it was much more diffuse, and the Indian state itself didn't really care too much about what was going on. So the India-China Friendship Association emerges out of much more grassroots kind of interest. And so you have these different chapters. You have, the West Bengal chapter, the Maharashtra chapter, you have a chapter in Andhra Pradesh, and so on. They all emerge, they're organic, they try and recruit from a local population that is just genuinely interested in China. So as a result, you see a much more diverse set of opinions and a diverse set of approaches on the Indian side. So someone as colorful as Karanjia,
I think there is some instability of name. Hello, sir. I
Hello?
think that there are some problems that have been created.
Yeah.
I think,
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. You can proceed.
Okay,
Yes,
so let me continue. I don't know how much of the answer was truncated when I was speaking, but what I wanted to say was that in India you see a much more uneven and diverse engagement across the different ICFAs. So you have someone like Rusi Karanjia, who was the editor of Blitz, which in the 50s was very, very pro China, promoting China-India solidarity, China-India mutual engagement. But then after 62 becomes very anti-China, right? So you see this kind of, after the war, it becomes much, much more anti-China. You have this kind of representation, but then you have people from all kinds of, all walks of life, some of whom have some government connection, but many of them really don't. They're just private individuals, journalists, intellectuals, just common people, not even having, not even with any particular investment in any kind of elite activity. So that you see less of on the Chinese side, I think. So there's an unevenness to these institutional, the ways in which these institutions work. That being said, I think this is again a fascinating history that we don't know much about, and it would if we can get access to archives and try and look at the way the membership, the ways in which the kinds of activities that were promoted both on the Chinese side and on the Indian side, I think that would be a very important way to recreate this history of engagement and mutual sort of not collaboration, but mutual sort of appraisal in some ways. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, sir. You have mentioned that during 1930s, these years onwards, there was a medical team that went to China.
Yes.
And the Indian representatives on behalf of the British. Yes, till 1952, no specialists from particularly the discipline of history went to China. And you have mentioned that after the late 20th century, there was an openness of archives. So archives in China, though the situation changed during the late 20th and early 21st century as due to the opening up of archives that I have mentioned. So my question is, was this kind of binary as to restriction to archive and preference of a discipline over the access to the archives affected the history writing of Indo-Chinese or Indo-Chino history?
Absolutely. I think this is a hugely important issue, and you've in some ways hit the nail on the head, because part of our ignorance is manufactured. Part of our ignorance is perhaps because we are not serious enough. But part of our ignorance is because there are real structural impediments to doing this kind of history, to learning about Indian approaches, Indian engagement with China, and Chinese engagement, and vice versa, Chinese with India. and there are various ways in which I think you can see this problem exist into the present. So for starters, I think we still do a very bad job of training students in India in the language, right? So a lot of people who end up doing Chinese studies in India still don't have the kind of competence in the Chinese language that you would need to be able to read Chinese sources, to be able to talk to colleagues and friends and people in China, to participate in workshops and conferences. And you really need this kind of basic engagement, even to figure out what kinds of materials might exist in archives in China, what kinds of questions are being asked in China, within the Chinese academic community, for instance, about Indian history and so on, right? So there is that level. But what makes this so much harder is the actual state of archives, the state of libraries that exist. And unfortunately, what I mentioned in my article and sort of the relative optimism that I had, when I said archives have opened up and they've created certain kinds of opportunities, on the Chinese side, unfortunately, that has already changed. Since about 2011, 2012, there has been a gradual but very consistent push to make archives more and more inaccessible in China. And this is not just for Indian scholars, or foreign scholars. It applies to Chinese scholars also. Even local Chinese scholars are having a harder time accessing archives to do research in China. This is partly an outcome of the more politicized nature of the situation in China under Xi Jinping and so on. And in some ways, again, it echoes what's happening in India, right? With under the present government, there has been a consistent attempt to narrow down and make history essentially serve a state narrative in a very, very narrow way. So that has made it difficult to, I think, pursue research questions, to pursue materials in archives and libraries and so on. So I'm now less optimistic than I was even 4 years ago or 5 years ago that we will be able to do certain kinds of research. That being said, there is still a lot of material that does exist that we can access. So part of it is being more creative, thinking more creatively about what constitutes the archive. And one of your earlier questions is a good example of this, right? If we think about film and art, a lot of this stuff is just out there in front of us. We can go to museums, we can go watch movies, we can read literature, and through this you can actually discover all kinds of sort of ways in which we can analyze and understand the China-India relationship without relying on archives. Yes, not having archives it limits us, but it doesn't necessarily completely constrain us. So we have to be more creative in thinking about how we do research. But I did an interview. I don't know if you've had the chance to see it, about a month or 2 months ago, for Himal South Asian, which is this journal used to be published out of Nepal, but now they've relocated to Sri Lanka, which is sort of a have you heard of it? Himal South Asian?
Yes, sir.
Have you heard of it? Himal South Asian?
Emancipation?
No, Himal is in Himalaya. Himal South Asian.
Himalaya, South Asia. I have heard of
it. It's a journal. It's a magazine. Anyway, so what I'll do is I'm happy to share with you and Sambit. I did an interview that spoke to precisely this question of China studies in India, and what both where the opportunities are and what the challenges are in some ways. So if you're interested, then I can share that with you. Where I go into a lot more detail about some of these issues, both about training, about access to archives, and so on. The other aspect that I think is worth reflecting upon, and it's happening everywhere in the world, is digitization. To what extent? So on the one side, people say digitization is a great thing because you have all these, dusty archival materials sitting. No one knows what's in them. They're in many cases not just gathering dust, but being destroyed because of climate or because of pests and so on. So if we digitize them, then we create a much more permanent record, and anyone can access them and so on. That's the very optimistic spin on this. And yes, if done well, it can really be transformative. But the other danger is when you have a state that is always interfering and you allow it to digitize things, then you are allowing it essentially, you have no way of checking what gets digitized and what gets made available to you. So it is an attempt, it is an opportunity for an extremely intrusive state to essentially recreate the archive to suit its agenda, right? So there is that danger also. And we know in certain instances this has already happened in China, it's happened in India to some extent also, where when you have an archive, say, that looks at, say, the Bureau of Agriculture, just hypothetically speaking, its entire archive from in India, say from 47 to 64 under Nehru, that period, exists in as a physical archive that you can access. But now they've digitized it. So what they've done is they said, okay, we've made everything available digitally, which means that you can no longer look at the original documents, because the original documents have moved into a different repository further away, much harder to get to for safekeeping. That's the logic, that now we're preserving it better. But in digitizing it, they have maybe not made available several critical documents. There's no way for the researcher to even know that these might not be available anymore, right? So that kind of challenge also has become a huge issue in any kind of research going forward.
My next question is, we know that after 1947, India's basic foundation that has been taken by first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, that essence of socialism, and China after 1949, as we are all accustomed, that is communism. Given these instances, the nature of relations and coherence in the initial years up to 1962, to say for instance, was a combined effort to restrict the advent of dominant Western capitalism to the East. Was there any following measurement that was taken by these two countries combinedly or independently?
Measurement of what precisely?
Measurement means because there was a horror, the two different countries. Between China, they followed the communism. In India, there was socialist economy. So the horror of capitalism that was being spreaded all over the world. So these two countries combinedly took any measurement or took any process?
Right. I understand your question. So my sense is no, because in the 50s, as far as a lot of economic policy making was concerned, the Chinese saw themselves much more closely in line with the Soviet Union. So to that extent, they were part of a socialist world economy, and a lot of the policy making that they engaged in was really with that in mind, that we are part of that kind of alternative to Western capitalism. And in that, they actually did not have a very favorable opinion of India. As far as they were concerned, the Indian independence movement was really not a transformative and revolutionary movement, because what happened was that a particular elite that was elite already under the British rule had continued to stay in power. So they saw the India's independence essentially as an incomplete, or even worse, just not revolutionary at all from a socialist and communist perspective. So there was a degree of, in spite of the engagement, in spite of the interest, there was also a degree of doubt about whether India can be considered, India under Nehru, India under this sort of mixed economy model, can really be considered a true ally as far as socialism and communism are concerned. So you don't see the kind of what you're asking in terms of the real joint attempt to forge some kind of, whether it's global policy, global economic policy, and so on. To the extent that there is interest, it's more localized in terms of what is India doing and how might that be useful in China, or what is China doing and how might that be useful in India. There are some examples, of course. After Bandung, there's an attempt at an alternative solidarity, and there's also an attempt because Bandung, I think, signals in some ways China's own attempt to start to slowly distance itself from the Soviet Union, to try and carve out its own identity within the socialist world in a more clear way, right? So, but that is again vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and not so much, I think, directed by a kind of commitment to China-India doing something in a truly collaborative and truly socialist or even communist way. So I think, the short answer is actually no, that you don't see a real commitment in this regard. Partly because, as I said, the Chinese just don't see India as being revolutionary enough from a communist and socialist perspective.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your valuable answer regarding my question. I think that we should go forward to the questions of the audiences. I am requesting to our host, Sambit Roychowdhury, to show the questions in the screen that is taken from the audiences. The first question is from Suprakash Vishwas. Is it in Bengali? Will I translate it for you, or will you able to?
Why don't you just read it? You can just read it out, so then everyone can hear it also. So that way.
Okay. He is saying, যেখানে সারা বিশ্বে কমিউনিজমকে বিশ্বের পক্ষে ক্ষতিকর ধরে নেওয়া হচ্ছে, সেখানে চীন সমাজতান্ত্রিক ধারণাকে এখনো বয়ে নিয়ে চলেছে। চীনের পক্ষে এটা কতটা কঠিন?
So it is difficult because আমি অর্ধেকটা বাংলায় বলতে মানে এই যে অডিয়েন্সে সবাই বাংলা বলে না, মানে মানে অন্য জায়গা থেকেও আছে যারা শুনছে যারা মানে বাংলা জানে না।
You can give your answer in English also. So
ইংলিশ বেঙ্গলি বোথ। না মানে সবচেয়ে কঠিন ব্যাপারটা মানে কমিউনিজমের ডেফিনেশনটা কি সেটাই এখন ঠিক নয় চায়নাতে। মানে যে এককালে যে একটা ডেফিনেশন ছিল কি আমরা কমিউনিস্ট আছি তার মানে এইরকম একটা কমিটমেন্ট আছে, সেটাই অ্যাকচুয়ালি এখন ক্লিয়ার নয়। কেন কি যদি প্র্যাকটিসে দেখা যায় যে চাইনিজ পলিটিক্যাল ইকোনমি যেটা আছে পোস্ট 78 ওটা শুধু রেটরিক্যালি কমিউনিস্ট, কেন কি এখনো ওই কমিটমেন্টটা ওরা মানে রেটরিক্যালি ছাড়তে পারেনি। কিন্তু ইন প্র্যাকটিস যেটা ওরা করছে ইজ মানে ইন মেনি কেসেস ফুল ব্লোন ক্যাপিটালিস্ট ইন টার্মস অফ যেভাবে কোম্পানিগুলো অর্গানাইজ হয়েছে। অফকোর্স ওরা এটা বলে কি সোশ্যালিজম উইথ চাইনিজ ক্যারেক্টারিস্টিক্স, দ্যাট ইজ দেয়ার মানে কি বলবো রেটরিক্যাল একটা ফ্লারিশ দিয়েছে। তো আই থিঙ্ক বড় প্রশ্নটা হলো কি এখন কমিউনিজমটা ইটসেলফ কি, আর যারা মানে এখন কমিটেড কমিউনিস্ট পার্টিতে মেম্বার আছে কার্ড ক্যারিং ওর আইডিওলজিক্যালি যারা কমিটেড এখনো টু সাম কাইন্ড অফ কমিউনিজম, তারা মানে তাদের চীনের প্রতি কি আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং আছে আর তারা কিরকম একটা রেভলিউশন এখন ভাবছে হতে পারে। I think that is the bigger question. My personal sense is that the Chinese state can no longer be seen as being helpful in that struggle at all, because they have long since given up any, they are using it instrumentally. That আমরা যে সিসিপি আছি আমরা এটা ইউজ করব বিকজ আমাদের পুরো একটা ফাউন্ডেশন আছে যেটা রেটরিক্যালি কমিউনিজম উপরে বিল্ড, কিন্তু in terms of actual commitments I'm not so clear ওটা এখনো আছে, in terms of restructuring society and so on. And you see this in within within Chinese society itself, let alone outside, in terms of ওদের যেভাবে minorities এর সঙ্গে ওদের ব্যবহার, আর তারপরে যে inequality যেভাবে বেড়েছে চায়নাতে এখন, these are huge concerns and it's not clear how they're addressing them. তো মানে বড় প্রশ্নটা আমার জন্য হচ্ছে কি যে ফিউচার গ্লোবাল লেফট যেটা আছে মানে ইন্ডিয়াতে চায়নাতে না অন্য দেশে, ওদের এবারে কি দায়িত্ব। কিন্তু অনেকগুলো এমন আছে যারা উইলিনিলি চায়নাকে সাপোর্ট করতে চায় বিকজ চায়না ইজ স্ট্যান্ডিং আপ টু ওয়েস্টার্ন ইম্পেরিয়ালিজম এন্ড আমেরিকা এন্ড সো অন, এন্ড তাতে একটা লজিক আছে, বাট উইদাউট ফুললি অ্যানালাইজিং চায়না কি করছে, ইজ চায়না অ্যাকচুয়ালি ইজ ইট promoting any kind of alternative that is worth pursuing globally or even for Chinese people. যতক্ষণ ওই প্রশ্নটা নিয়ে ক্ল্যারিটি না হয় ততক্ষণ to support China is also I think not so straightforward.
Our next question is from Riti Banerjee. The question is, what was the role played by Soviet Union in the Chinese Civil War in bringing the Chinese Communist Party to power by defeating KMT or Kuomintang China?
So this is it's an interesting question. There's a lot of good scholarship on this now that you can access. The standard Chinese state narrative has been to minimize this influence, to say that এটা আমরা নিজেই করেছি, নিজস্ব করেছি, that আমরা Chiang Kai-shekকে যে হারিয়েছি, but if you go back and look at the increasing amounts of, especially in the 90s যখন Soviet archives opened up and a lot of people did research on the Sino-Soviet sort of connection and history, and to look at Stalin কত investment ছিল, Chinese Civil War and so on, then you see that there was actually a consistent Soviet presence and influence throughout the CCP from the 20s itself. When 1921 the Communist Party of China is formed, তখন থেকে had the nature and degree changed a lot. But the influence was hugely important in even before 1945 and then after 1945 also, when the civil war started. I can speak a lot more, but that's a short answer actually. So
okay, the next question is from Aditya Shankar Chattopadhyay, that how far India is succeeded or will be succeeded to abolish the dominance of China. What is the future of China's economic dominance in South Asia, and especially among our neighbor countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, and how far this dominance will harm India's foreign policy?
Lots of questions, lots of difficult in a sense, difficult to know, because they're about the future and about interstate relations, which today it's, most of us have no access to actual, the kinds of conversations that are going on in the elite government levels. But I think the important thing to realize is that
I think that he faced some problem in internet instability. Sir, can you able to hear me? So, audience, please keep some patience. I think that there is some instability in internet. We will address every questions, and I think that he will join with us soon. So I am requesting to my moderator immediately contact with him as early as possible, because there are some lagging of internet.
Hello.
Yes.
So I don't know what happened, but the connection got cut.
So the question was, sir, will I show the question again?
Please, if you don't mind.
Okay. So the question was that how far India is succeeded or will be succeeded to abolish the dominance of China. What is the future of Chinese economic dominance in South Asia, and especially among our neighbor countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, and how far this dominance will harm India's foreign policy?
So I think the general way to think about this is that this is going to be a consistent challenge for Indian foreign policy going forward, and it has at least a few different reasons, right? One is, of course, that China does not want to see India emerge as a significant challenger. Just the way the US is concerned about China's rise right now, China is to some extent concerned that it doesn't want to see a significant challenge emerge so close to its physical borders itself. So I think one can expect to see a consistent attempt to destabilize India's relationship with its neighbors. Pakistan is obvious, but also Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, increasingly possible Bhutan also. So I think that is a given. The question is in some ways not so much what are the Chinese going to do. The question is how is the Indian foreign policy establishment going to respond? And I think here what we have seen so far has been actually quite disappointing, and not just with the current government, but there's an inability to take China seriously for a much longer period in time. And one of the things that is a good example of why I think we are failing at a very fundamental level is, I don't know if you saw this in the new education policy documents that were released. They also said that Chinese will no longer be a language that will be offered at the school level. So in some ways, if we acknowledge that China, from an Indian national security perspective, from an Indian foreign policy perspective, but also from a basic sort of economic perspective, given how reliant the Indian economy has become on the Chinese economy, in particular on trade with China, given all of those, given that reality, for us not to have a stronger engagement and understanding of China is a huge mistake, in my opinion. Yes, if they're good friends, you want to know them. But in some ways, if there's a potential enemy in your backyard, it's even more important to know that enemy. And therefore, to sort of not say, teach Chinese to students in India, to not have rigorous programs of research at the university level, which is really a problem in India right now. There is very little serious research on China in India. So all of our understanding of China is dependent on Western scholarship. English language scholarship produced in the West, and their concerns are different, right? So if you look at, if you want to understand foreign policy questions, you can't rely on American foreign policy perspectives to understand China-India relations. So we need to, I think, build a tremendous capacity to understand some of these problems. So China will do what it does. It is the world's, by one metric, the world's largest economy already, if you look at purchasing power parity, and it's going to do certain things that are actually structural to the nature of geopolitics. It has a tremendous need for resources. It has a tremendous need to develop and continue developing to try and provide its people with better livelihoods. That will mean expanding into areas, that will mean trying to get resources in Africa and Latin America. And you will see patterns that in some ways, people have already started making these connections to the expansion of Western colonial empires in the 18th and 19th centuries, right? It's the same kind of, in some ways, a similar kind of rhetoric evolves, where we are here, to trade. We are not here to interfere. We are here to, improve everyone's lives. But then slowly you get involved in sovereign issues. You get involved in land. Much like if you look at the history of the East India Company in India, they arrived as traders. For the first 100 years, they were only trading. And then over time, they became involved in local territorial battles that became regional ones. And then suddenly they get a firman from the Mughal Empire that you are responsible for tax in Bengal. So, you see, and so what is happening in Hambantota is an example of that in Sri Lanka, right? Where suddenly they have a lease on a port for 99 years. So these processes have a certain sort of, they're organic. They don't have, it's not that China, the Chinese elite necessarily have a clear sense that this is what we're going to do. We're building an empire. But there is a certain logic to the way in which the economy has grown and the way in which it is continuing to sort of need resources and other things. So from the Indian perspective, it is going to be a huge challenge. And given that China sees India as a potential regional rival, it will try and destabilize India by building stronger ties with our neighboring countries. But as I said, I think the much more important thing is to then see what should we be doing in response, right? So not so much only worrying about what will China do and not. We have to increase our capacity to respond, and that capacity has to start with knowledge, not necessarily with yes, military and other kinds of expenditure are important, but at a very core level, knowledge is much more important.
Okay, I think we should move to the last question, and the last question is from Nidhi Shukla. How realistic are chances of committed collaborative exercise as undertaken by countries helpful in restraining Chinese geopolitical ambitions?
Yeah, this is a good question, because it's very unclear in terms of, we never know how useful what will be. But I think in general, as a general principle, I think keeping channels of communication, keeping sort of track to people kinds of exchanges open is better than their absence. And I think the Cold War is a good example of this, right? If you look at the 50s, even the way in which China's foreign relations with many countries in the 50s and 60s were, they're completely cut off after 1949. And that led to ignorance being built up, right? We had no idea of what was going on in China besides the few visits that people were making. And you see sort of a kind of research that in the 60s and 70s and 80s used to be called Kremlinology, right? With regard to the Soviet Union, and now with China is called Pekinology. So Peking, from Beijing, which is literally relying on only newspaper reports, and then reading photographs and looking at videos of, there was a May Day parade, which leader was standing next to which leader, what does that mean? Does this mean that so-and-so leader has been demoted? What we still do with North Korea, for instance, right? When we look at who is standing, which general is standing next to Kim Jong-un, and what does that mean? That is a very superficial level of trying to understand what is going on in any place. So, and I think, therefore, to have a kind of people-to-people exchange is hugely important, because it, I think, also allows for because the other danger, I think, is when you have this kind of very limited interaction, is that you allow the state to set the narrative. And the state, any state, always has, in my understanding, the state is by virtue a perverse actor. It does not, unless it is constrained, unless there is pressure put on it by people, it will never actually act in the best ways, because it's in the end, its objective is state power, to increase state power. And it can be as inhumane, it can be as amoral, not immoral, but amoral in its pursuit of that goal, right? So to that extent, I think to have more people-to-people contact means that there are alternative channels for different understandings to emerge that are not purely understandings that the state is directing. because the state will have its own incentive to promote a particular narrative, whether it's to demonize another country, whether it is to say how to say that this particular policy is the best one to pursue, and so on. So if you have a much wider range of exchange and collaboration and understanding, then you have more voices that can actually contribute and say, well, this is one perspective, but it's actually flawed in this way or not, that way, and so on. So to that extent, I think it's as a baseline condition, it's very important. It may not be sufficient. I think, we have seen so many instances where we try and stay engaged and so on, but in spite of that, wars happen, relations between countries completely collapse, and so on. But I think in the absence of these kinds of interactions, that likelihood is significantly higher anyway. So we should aspire to at least continue to keep channels open, and to recognize that people everywhere, the common people, have essentially the same in terms of what drives them, the motivations, and the way in which they want to think about other people. So as long as we can remind ourselves of that and seek that, I think maintaining other channels is hugely important. Maintaining friendships, collaborations, knowing colleagues, in the Indian case and Chinese case, knowing colleagues in China, working with them together, reading their scholarship, trying to understand what kinds of questions are motivating their research, is hugely important.
Okay, so we have come to the end of the session. And thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your excellent talk and addressing the, I think, again, the internet's problems have been raised. And sir, can you able to hear me? Oh, there are internet instability from him, I think. Sir? Sir, can you able to hear me, sir? Sir, can you able to hear me? Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your excellent talk and addressing the question that came from the audience. And thank you again for inspiring us. Hello. Can you able?
Yeah. I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. Have you want to give some comments regarding to your last questions, or you have just concluded it?
No, that is. I mean, there's nothing more that I can. I mean, there's a lot more to say, but nothing that will change the basic gist of what I said. So
okay.
Yeah.
So we have already come to the end of the sessions, and thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your excellent talk and addressing the question that came from audiences. And thank you again for inspiring us to give success of this lecture that was hosted by me and Sambit on behalf of Voyages into the Past and Utit Prabaho. So thank you, sir. Thank you very much for enriching this session, and that will help to increase our empirical knowledge.
Absolutely. No, it was my pleasure to join you, and I hope both you and the other members in the audience found it interesting. So thank you very much for having me.
Okay. Thank you. And I want to thanks to our audiences who have joined with us and who have beared with us during this session, during this interactive sessions. And you want to give any suggestions, if you can contact with us through mail, through messenger, through phones. And for various updates and upcoming updates, please keep watch the page of Voyages into the Plus or Utit Prabaho. So thank you very much.
Can I say one final thing at the end? Sorry.
Yes, sir, of course.
Yeah. So just a general sort of, if for anyone who's interested, who's listening, who would want to read, on any of the aspects we talked about over the past hour, they should feel free to email me. My email is easily available online from my faculty page. And I'd be happy to send the materials, or either if I have the PDFs handy, I'll send the PDFs, but if not, then I'll be happy to send them the citations if they want to read on different aspects. So please, they should feel free to get in touch.
Okay, sir, thank you for helping us too much. I think that it will help us most to not only making contact with you, but also to know about the bilateral relationship and the statistical accounts of China, People's Republic of China before its independence and after its independence. Mm-hmm. So thank you, sir, for this session.
Great.
And thank you
Great.
to our
audience. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.